welcome everyone to the 2024 David Morrison Lecture in International Development. I'm Feyzi Baban, Chair of the Department of Global Justice and Development, what is known to be the International Development Studies, and what it used to be Comparative Development Studies. That's our third name. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. As we gather tonight, we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Nations for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. At Trent, we strive to be a strong partner, enhancing the community and the culture of Peterborough. Sharing knowledge, such as we are doing tonight, is just one of the ways we give back to our community. And our community, in turn, helps us to enhance the university and the student experience in many ways, including philanthropy. In times of funding cuts and budget pressures, the impact and importance of giving is truly felt. Tonight is thanks to the generosity of Professor Emeritus Dr. David Morrison and Professor Emerita Dr. Elena Heitlinger. And we have the honor of having them in the audience this evening. If I may ask you to stand up, Professor Morrison and Professor Heitlinger, to acknowledge. David is a former director of Trent International Program and a long-time member of the politics department and the founding chair of what would become the Department of International Development Studies and now Department of Global Justice and Development. The David Morrison Lecture in International Development brings globally distinguished scholars who are renowned for the impact of their intellectual and applied work on international development studies to Trent University to address the members of Trent and Peterborough communities. On behalf of Trent University and Peterborough community, we thank Professor Morrison and Professor Heitlinger for their vision and dedication and for the legacy they have left at our university in so many different ways. Thank you. And now I'm going to ask our new president, Dr. Kathy Bruce, to have some opening remarks on this.
Thank you, Feyzi. It is so nice to see so many people here tonight. I would call this a full house. Well done, especially in the cold. I put my sweater and my jacket on thinking it might work to come out in that. And good evening. I'm Kathy Bruce, president of Trent University, and I'm pleased to bring greetings on behalf of Trent. I'd also like to take this opportunity to relay our gratitude on behalf of Trent to David Morrison and Elena Heitlinger for making this series possible. Thank you for your continued commitment to the intellectual life of the university and the community. This year's Morrison Lecture by Fionnuala Ní Aoláin, and I think I got that pretty close, on human rights coincides with the launch of Trent's new degree in human rights and global justice. This degree is the first of its kind at Trent, and while the degree is housed in the Department of Global Justice and Development, it was conceived of as interdisciplinary, a degree that was contributed to by departments of Indigenous Studies, Canadian Studies, Sociology, Gender and Social Justice. So that is certainly in keeping with Trent's long-standing commitment to interdisciplinary study. And in a similar spirit, the Morrison Lecture is interdisciplinary at its core in the way that it aims to provide a focal point for discussions, important discussions on the vital issues of our time from a critical interdisciplinary perspective. I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our talk this evening. May we collectively continue to create spaces for bright minds to gather and propel human rights and justice. Thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kathy. And this lecture actually is, the Morrison Lecture is special every year. It's a really sort of core of our intellectual life at the department, and it gets us going in the fall. But this year is particularly important for us because the lecture coincides, as Kathy mentioned, with the new degree on human rights. And one person who was instrumental in his dedication to push this degree through was our former chair, Chris Bayers. So I'm going to ask Chris to come and say a couple of things about what we foresee and how this new degree will unfold. So I'll ask Chris maybe to come and say a couple of words.
Thank you very much, Daisy. Thank you, Kathy, as well for coming, and for everybody else, welcome. So, yes, I'm Chris Bayers, and I'm the coordinator of the new Human Rights and Global Justice Program, or HURRY, which also means hurry up and get through the degree. Actually, it's a great acronym that one of the people who contributed to this this effort, who could not be here, came up with. And so, we're excited to launch this program this year. And the program is important for Trent University in consolidating its work on justice and strengthening its international programming. The Department of Global Justice and Development has long focused on rights-based perspectives, and we are now building on this with this new program, which I think is well structured and robust, but also draws widely from across the university. And so I want to thank the departments that Kathy mentioned, and also mentioned philosophy and political studies post, for also collaborating and designing this program. I don't know if sociology was mentioned. Sociology was mentioned. Okay. So, got to make sure I don't miss anybody. So, what distinguishes this program is its truly global and transnational focus. It has a strong emphasis as well on social and economic justice, especially in the global south. We explore the lasting effects of colonialism, imperialism, globalization on human rights in these regions. A key aspect of our study includes looking at movements and advocates that push for social justice on pressing issues concerning human rights, including genocide, violence against women and girls, reproductive rights, indigenous rights, forced migration, LGBTQ+ rights, and economic inequality. HURRY is also set apart by its experiential components and offers placements abroad, including opportunities in Bolivia and Ghana in particular, as well as a host of placements here in Peterborough. Now, today's launch is celebratory, though it coincides with the somber anniversary of the onslaught on Gaza, which started a day after the terrible events of October 7th. So this has raised deep questions about the purpose and efficacy of human rights, shining a bright light on the inconsistencies of Western discourses, which are often critiqued for their advocacy, advocating human rights, alongside active engagement in conflict. Despite the remarkable mobilization of human rights and international law, the current situation raises the question of whether, as Hannah Arendt said, human rights frameworks are able to offer recourse when they're most needed. However, the questioning of human rights does not mean that they're not important. They're rather a kind of indication of what's at stake in the discussion of human rights. They remain a critical terrain for struggle by progressive movements and communities fighting for justice. The Hurry program provides a vital space to engage with these issues at a time when critical debate is increasingly stifled. In this context, it's wonderful to have Professor Ní Aoláin with us today, and the topic of tonight's talk being very timely and important. In closing, I encourage all of you, students, faculty, members of the broader community, to engage with the Hurry program going forward. We'll be hosting a series of talks and events which will be posted on our website. And this begins with coffee for students who would like to, kind of have a post-lecture discussion and so on with Professor Ní Aoláin. Tomorrow tomorrow morning from 10 to 12 in the cottage at Trent University. I also especially want to mention that applications for the Trent and Bolivia program running this winter semester are still being accepted through this weekend until Monday. And that there are significant funding opportunities available, especially for students who want to go this year. And our other study abroad program, Trent in Ghana, its application deadline is at the end of January, and there will be upcoming open houses and information sessions and so on in November and onwards. So thank you very much. And now I'm pleased to invite to the stage Professor Haroon Akram Lodi to introduce the speaker.
This is a great turnout. I'm very pleased to see so many people. So thank you, Chris. For those of you who don't know me, I'm, as Chris said, Haroon Akram Lodi, and I'm a professor in the Department of Global Justice and Development here at Trent University. It's truly an honor to welcome and introduce tonight's speaker, my friend Dr. Fionnuala Ní Aoláin. Luck to that, didn't I? I've had the privilege of knowing Finn, as she likes to be called, for 6 years, since 2018. We worked together for 4 of those years on the board of the Women's Rights Program of the Open Society Foundations in New York City. Finn had been on the board for several years when I joined it, and she had served as chair of the board. During our time on the board, I think we were able to stir up a lot of what the late John Lewis called good trouble, some of which is public and some of which will never be so. We also had a lot of fun until the program was closed down by the former president of the Open Society Foundations. What I learned about Finn during our time on the board can be summarized in 2 very short sentences. She has a fierce intelligence, and she is a forceful advocate. Perhaps it's the fact that she's Irish. Finn is Regents Professor and Robina Professor of Law, Public Policy and Society at the University of Minnesota Law School in Minneapolis, and concurrently she's also Professor of Law at the Queen's University in Belfast in the north of Ireland. She's the recipient of numerous academic awards and honours and has published extensively in the fields of emergency powers, counterterrorism and human rights, conflict regulation, transitional justice, and gender-based violence in times of war. Her book, Law in Times of Crisis, was awarded the American Society of International Law's Preeminent Prize in 2007. Finn was also the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights from 2017 to 2023. Now, for those of you in the room who don't know, special rapporteurs in the UN system are human rights experts who investigate human rights challenges and violations. They're not paid by the UN itself and so are independent of the UN and its member states, which allows the special rapporteurs to speak their mind. Her interventions as special rapporteur, many for the Uyghurs, for example, in Xinjiang, in Syria, in other places, but for me in particular, one stands out. As part of a mission to the United States between February and May 2023, Finn became the first special rapporteur to gain access to the Guantanamo Bay detention facility in Cuba and the detainees being held there. There are still 30 detainees being held in Guantanamo who are forgotten by the international community, and I believe I'm right in saying that 3 of them have never been charged with anything. These detainees have been held in custody for longer than the lives of our graduating 4th-year students, and for a very long time, of course, without any charges at all. Indulge me, please, while I read from her June 2023 report of that mission, and I quote, "It is evident that the horror and harms of extraordinary rendition, arbitrary detention, and systematic torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment inflicted over time occurred in part because of an exceptional and international law deficient legal and policy regime. The permeation of arbitrariness across subsequent detention practices and the lack of international law compliant domestic oversight and accountability. Guantanamo is an expression of the breakdown in international law. And I would suggest that there's a straight line from Guantanamo through the 9/11 wars to the genocide in Gaza. This is the world in which many people in their 20s have become normalized into, and this is what we need to understand if we're going to try and change this world for the better. The university is honored to host Finn this evening for her talk entitled The Rise of Counterterrorism and the Fall of Human Rights. And after the talk, there will be lots of time for questions and answers after this. I believe it's the 14th David Morrison Lecture in International Development. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fionnuala Ní Aoláin.
Thank you. Old age tells you I need my glasses to read, so we'll start there. First of all, I want to give my thanks to David Morrison and for the honor of giving this lecture, and also to Elena. It was lovely to meet you earlier. And mostly I owe a big and enduring thank you to my friend and colleague Haroon Akram Lodi, who persisted in making this lecture happen. He persisted and was prepared to pick me up at 11 o'clock last night in Toronto as my plane landed and get me here for just past, I wouldn't say an hour past the midnight hour. I am in debt to his scholarship, his humanity, and his good humor. I'm also really delighted to be back in Canada. As a very young Irish woman, I came here in 1985 to a place called Pearson College on Vancouver Island as a UWC student, and it has shaped the person I am, and all those whom I met there have shaped who I am today. So I'm going to start and say that in the aftermath of ongoing and sustained terrorist attacks, which are directed across the world at civilian objects and population, as well as what many of us are still living with, which is the ongoing impact of the terrorist attack of October 7th and the response to that, as well as reports of resurgence of groups such as Daesh. These are the terrorist group which established the caliphate in Syria. This specter of collective violence and violence including acts of terrorism is just never far away from us. But to go back, and I want to go back to 9/11. 9/11 was that most visible, highly significant of terrorist acts, and it encompassed not just enormous consequences for the thousands of victims from across the world, and the families of those victims who still live with the consequences of 9/11. But its consequences were most egregious for those who were caught up in the aftermath of that attack. And that included the 779 men and boys, one of whom was a Canadian, who were rendered and tortured to Guantanamo, Cuba, and the 30 men who still remain there, most of whom have been forgotten about. People don't even remember that there is a place called Guantanamo where a democracy holds men without trial for over 2 decades. And it was this response to the 9/11 attack that spawned this language of a so-called war on terror and a growth and consolidation of these kinetic tactics in counterterrorism that has had this just enormously globally sized impact. But it did a couple of really important things. One, it recalibrated this global consensus on the unacceptability of terrorism. And we would all agree with that at the level of general principle. But it also, this recalibration happens in a universe where we do not have a globally agreed definition of terrorism, because states have not been able over the last multiple decades to agree a definition of terrorism. And what that did was that it enabled this constructive ambiguity on what precisely the thing terrorism is, but gave enormous latitude to states to figure out how they would respond to it. And so this tension between a global consensus that terrorism is a bad thing, but no definition of terrorism, left this enormous space of ambiguity and permissibility to states. And it's that permissibility, that the line that Haroon drew, I want to draw for you today, which is the consequences of those two things: universal agreement and a lack of definition. And even, we go back to the Obama administration, where there came to be agreement that this language of a war on terror was not a good thing and was expressly disavowed by President Obama. And what we saw, in fact, emerging on one level, there's this disavowal of this language of a war on terror. But actually, at the same time, what you have is a bedding in of the institutions, the norms, and the practices that emerged after 9/11. So most of us might think that actually terrorism as a language is not really a significant language because we've lost this language of a war on terror. But I want to tell you that over the last 2 decades, what we've seen is not a receding of the language and practice of terrorism, but rather, I would assert that this half-life of 9/11 has extended, even as that language on a war on terror was going away. And that normative and institutional counterterrorism has been bedding in. And it's been bedding in because this language serves important, deliberately so, functions for states. And it serves important functions for both democratic and non-democratic states alike. So rather than seeing a demise in counterterrorism over the past couple of decades, counterterrorism and its associated security doctrines are propagating. They're breeding. They're getting bigger and less containable over time. And as they do so, they are normatively undermining some of the fundamental planks of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. My colleague and friend Gavin Sullivan, a professor of law at Edinburgh University, talks about assemblages of counterterrorism, meaning these places and institutions of counterterrorism are not just growing, but they remain constant. They also remain extremely well-funded and broadly accepted by states, democratic and non-democratic alike. And I maintain, as I did during my time as UN Special Rapporteur, that this entrenchment of counterterrorism is undermining human rights. It has enabled transnational repression, it has undermined democracy, and it presents a sustaining threat to the rule of law nationally, as well as a sustaining and pervasive threat to the idea of a rules-based international order. The argument I'm going to make for you today has 4 parts. So I want to trend for you a trend line of ascendant counterterrorism, which for me is rooted not just in a story about 9/11, but goes back to histories of exceptionality, as well as the debris of colonial practices that have contained militarism and misogyny over millennia. And again, it is this lack of agreement on what is terrorism over time that actually allows states this permissive scope of action. And I want to say that this lack of agreement by states on what is counterterrorism is really deliberate, because it's not that definition eludes us. It's precisely because a lack of definition is useful to states that we have a lack of definition. And in fact, it's necessary for states to have this lack of definition because it serves their interest and their purpose. These interests allow states to say that terrorism is a bad thing, but that more importantly, every single state, including Canada, gets to define terrorism on its own terms. And those own terms, it's like the perfect gentleman's agreement, that we all get to agree that it's bad, but you get to say what it is, and we will never call you out on your definition of terrorism. You will get to do what you like in your own sphere of influence without us ever saying that we don't accept that, whether it's China, Russia, the United States, Egypt, I could go on. So the second thing I want to do after charting this sort of route that counterterrorism has charted over millennia is to really focus in on 9/11 and to highlight a couple of institutional things that have happened since 9/11 that I think are really important and explain in a way the challenge we face today. I want to highlight the ascendant role of the UN Security Council, and in particular, the role that the United Nations Security Council, acting under a mechanism of Chapter 7 of the Charter, that chapter of the UN Charter requires states to implement whatever the Security Council does, that the Security Council has been using this Chapter 7 mechanism diligently, and in doing so expanded the normative scope of counterterrorism over the past 2 decades. Since 9/11, the Security Council first met literally days after the events of 9/11, as the ash is still smoldering on the Twin Towers. The Security Council meets, and it starts this sort of ball rolling, this normative ball rolling, in which it not only issues sweeping statements of principle and prevention, but it puts this clear obligation on states under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to prevent and regulate terrorism. What we also see in this role, this elevated role of the Security Council, which everyone I think in the room knows is not a representative body of states, which is a Security Council with veto power by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and is an institution that is broadly closed off to experts, human rights advocates, civil society. This is the most closed of spaces within the United Nations, the one to which we have the least access in terms of shaping the norms in positive ways. And this is the body that takes on this elevated role after 9/11. And it has been one of my abiding concerns that this broad lawmaking role by the Security Council not only impinges on the sovereignty of states, and I still have an attachment to sovereignty. I think it's an important space that has good reason to be guarded, but it has deliberately overrode national constitutional and legislative protections for human rights. It operates in this exclusionary way that I've described, and it essentially excludes any way for human rights to come in the door. And that has been the case since 2001. The third thing I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to talk about something which is going to sound like an oxymoron for a lawyer to say, which is the ascendancy of something we will call soft law. So most of you in the room who are not lawyers, and we all mostly think of law as hard. It's either binding or it's not binding. But in international law, we have this particular species of law that we call soft law. And soft law is about law that's not hard, law that might be moving towards adoption, something like a General Assembly resolution or guidelines or principles. Students will have come across some of these things in their classes. But I want to show you how over the past 2 decades, the normal rules about soft and hard in international law have been inverted in the counterterrorism space. That is to say that informal practices have become increasingly hard in the counterterrorism arena. And the place I first encountered this was when I was UN Special Rapporteur, and I would go to countries at their invitation, and I would talk to them about the hard legal obligations they were bound by, the treaties that they had signed, the hard law of customary international law, the things that we know as international lawyers states should be doing. And then I would find myself in what I would call like an Alice in Wonderland situation, where the states would talk back to me in soft law, and they would say, well, we've signed up to these principles on counterterrorism enforcement, or we're enforcing the FATF recommendations. And I sort of came to realize over time that for many states in the area of security and counterterrorism, the normal rules of international law don't apply. Actually, it's these things that we think of as soft that are driving state practice. And these things that are soft are being produced in spaces where, to be clear, there are no human rights actors, firmly away from those spaces where states might in fact have clear international human rights law obligations to shape the contours of their practice. The fourth thing I want to talk about is how the cost of this architecture, these institutions, these normative and institutional changes, that the costs of these changes have been most severely borne by civil society and human rights actors across the world. These are the victims of ascendant counterterrorism. And I want to close by saying, in a really grim and dark landscape where we might see some, I don't know, sprinkling of hope or maybe ways to do things better. So let me start at this sort of ascendancy, the ascendancy of counterterrorism. And here I want to talk about promiscuous and insidious counterterrorism. An Irish friend and legal scholar, Conor Gearty, who teaches at LSE, has used these terms, promiscuous and insidious, to describe the way that counterterrorism is moving and shaping our institutions and our legal norms. And I have borrowed it because I think both promiscuity and insidiousness applies really well to understanding the ways in which states have uniformly and indiscriminately embraced the looseness of counterterrorism. The casual conferral of a term like terrorism on a range of action, whether it's a women human rights defender in Saudi Arabia arguing for the right to drive. I think many of you know about the women human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia, but what you may not know is that they were prosecuted under counterterrorism law. Or we think of almost all of Egyptian civil society who has been charged under Egypt's deep, profound, and well-used counterterrorism laws. The casual conferment of the terms of counterterrorism apply not to the people we think of as terrorists, but people who in fact are exercising rights that are protected under international law. The right to assemble, the right to speak, the right to protest your own government, the right to participate in political affairs. These are the targets of promiscuous counterterrorism. And what we've seen is the capacity of institutions to adopt and sustain counterterrorism, to use the language of counterterrorism to proliferate its norms, to magnify certain actions, and to evolve very smartly over time. And in that context, I want to place the history of contemporary counterterrorism reach in a much more and older history of empire and colonial expansion. It is the case that many of the earliest counterterrorism laws find their histories in colonial expansion. And I use my own country, Ireland. Ireland was Britain's first colony, but it was also the place that became the testing ground for the laws, whether it's the penal laws of the 1800s to the Land Law Acts, of actually defining others in ways that use this language of exceptionality. And it's also understanding that not only is counterterrorism tied up with a history of empire, but counterterrorism is also deeply rooted in the language and practice of exceptionality in national legal systems. And so it is actually the opportunity of crisis that has often given rise to states for the opportunity to seek the exception, to modify, to look for new rules, to use, and it has always struck me, whether it was in the United Kingdom in the 1970s or even Canada in the aftermath of the Quebec Libre crisis. It is the opportunity of crisis that allows the state to go to the exception. And that exception is often, it's sort of sitting, waiting there. It's often been my experience that states are ready to go. What they're waiting for is a good crisis to give them the opportunity to activate it. And so we've seen this history of exceptionality really, really as the kind of undergirding framework and practice that enables and facilitates counterterrorism. But of course, the paradox here, and it's especially a paradox for lawyers, which is the thing that we want to use law and force against is opaque and shifty, right? We don't have an agreed definition of terrorism. And so we have this desire to connect law and legal process to a thing that's always moving. And in particular for democracies, that actually ought to be self-defeating, because the very essence of the rule of law is the idea of fixedness, certainty, predictability. But terrorism offers states this sort of ideal in between, which is the harnessing of law to the thing that is utterly ill-defined. And so it's the malleability of the terrorist and terrorism over time and over geography that leads, I think, to these fundamental tensions for rule of law states, because our other rules of certainty, predictability, proportionality all come under sustained pressure when we bring this unpredictability into the system. But it is the embrace of the term terrorism and its absolute unpredictability, which is really at the heart of what states are doing. They are, in fact, embracing that uncertainty when they do counterterrorism. Fixed meaning is the last thing that states want in this space, because what states desire in a realm of security is to maintain maximum flexibility in their scope of action against each other, but also against those whom they perceive as enemies within. And so we witness the constant play of words, mostly by democratic states, who on the one hand will decry the use of counterterrorism by their authoritarian counterparts. I would here hearken to Canada's deep criticism of China in relation to the Uyghurs. But at the same time, their imperial pasts have created the groundwork for use and abuse over time. And at the same time, they themselves, faced with crisis, will resort to the very same tools. So it's not by accident that states like China and Russia will say that we have a double standard, because we talk about what we won't accept about Uyghurs, but at the same time, the United Kingdom is running a program like PREVENT, which is one firmly focused on the exceptionalization and marginalization of Muslim minority communities in Britain. So these paradoxes have traction, they have steady state quality to them. And one of the things that's always amazed me is that even we can say, well, terrorism gets these moments of crisis and that allows terrorism to grow and respond. But even in times of calm, when there is, generally speaking, no specific acts of violence being perpetrated against states, counterterrorism as a rhetoric and a practice continues to press its legislative and executive tentacles. And part of the reason for that is this post-9/11 moment where states are deeply incentivized, profoundly incentivized to grow their security tentacles, and they're rewarded internationally for what we might call good counterterrorism practice. And there we see one of the huge challenges for states, because if you're a state who's engaged in systematic human rights violations, as many are, you can go to Geneva where you'll be roundly criticized by human rights advocates and maybe even by some other states on a bad day. But you know, you can forum shop. What you can choose to do is go to New York, where those same states will laud you for your absolutely top-class, top-notch work on counterterrorism. So states have figured out this sort of forum shifting really well. And they also understand that they can live with the criticism of human rights in Geneva while they're getting laudatory benefits for their good counterterrorism or security compliance in New York. So with that historical background, it's also fair to say, and I think it's apparent in my remarks, that counterterrorism has also had these incredible moments of growth, like a teenager who gets a growth spurt. There are jumps in counterterrorism and security practices, and we see them sort of glomming onto specific moments. And those specific moments are the moments when we see enormous consolidation. And 9/11 is one of those moments of extraordinary consolidation. And again, 9/11 confirms these two central vectors, namely that exceptionalism becomes entrenched as normal, right? So 9/11 was an exceptional event, but the processes, institutions, and norms that have followed 9/11 have become, many in the room wouldn't even recognize them as exceptional anymore. And that's the second vector, that the exception continues to grow and prosper even as the stated rationale for its invocation has long since disappeared. So let me talk a bit about what's happening at the UN. And there I want to take you to that Security Council space and talk a little bit about why it's so important that the UN has become the primary actor in driving the ascendancy of global counterterrorism. And the reason for that starts with this role that the UN Security Council started playing almost immediately after 9/11. What the UN did, what the Security Council did, is that it started legislating on counterterrorism. And I use that word quite deliberately because what the UN Security Council does in the counterterrorism space is different than it does in any other. Because generally speaking, historically and contemporaneously, the Security Council avoids legislating, even though Chapter 7 allows the Security Council to tell states what to do. Security Council has been very loath to tell states precisely what they could do because it's an encroachment on sovereignty. It's an encroachment on the normal processes of producing law in any state. But 9/11 changed that, and it changed it because the UN Security Council started producing precise and specific Security Council resolutions that tell states what they have to do without choice. And the most significant of those resolutions is a UN Security Council resolution called 1373. And this is a resolution that tells states that they have to legislate against terrorism, that they have to ensure that they are preventing the financing of terrorism, that they have to ensure that they are not allowing any support of terrorism. And what's the kicker? There's no definition of terrorism included in the resolution. Now, this is a really big deal because one of the things that comes out of 1373 is all of these requirements for states, and it was every single state without exception, comes without any substantive reference to human rights. So you've created a global mandate in an instant for states to regulate terrorism, but without offering them any guidelines at all on what terrorism would be. So if you're a repressive state, you would, I think, not unremarkably, spot an opportunity to do some things, which is precisely what many, many states did. They saw the opportunity, validated by the United Nations, to create systems of security and counterterrorism at the national level that targeted journalists, lawyers, dissidents, human rights defenders, people who simply disagreed with their governments, all under the imprimatur of preventing terrorism. And of course, part of what came with UN Security Council 1373 was not just a set of norms, but also a set of institutions. And one of the things that those institutions did, and most people look at the Security Council, and I tell my students, if you ask, I think any of the students in the room, they would say, well, the Security Council doesn't work. And I would generally agree with that. The Security Council doesn't work. But if you just go one layer down in the Security Council, after 9/11, under UN Security Council Resolution 1373, the Security Council created something called the Counterterrorism Committee. And guess what? That works really, really well. Because it turns out that the degree of unanimity of states across the board on terrorism is extremely high. So if you look at this first layer of the Security Council, you'll say it doesn't work. But if you look at the second layer of the Security Council that implements counterterrorism sanctions, that allows for the freezing of assets, that prevents people from traveling, that creates global watch lists, there's massive unanimity among states. And there's a mechanism of enforcement. And so again, I want to compare us to human rights, where we have a mechanism in Geneva, where states in theory should report on their human rights obligations. And many in the room who know anything about that know that states are not always very good at doing that. They report late, they report inadequately, they sometimes don't show up to defend their reports. But guess what? When states do counterterrorism reporting, they're on time, they're punctual, they're efficient, and they show up. And guess what? The whole process is entirely secret, because unlike Geneva, where if a state writes a human rights report, we would all get to see that. In New York, in the counterterrorism system, it's a closed system. You only get to see those reports if you're inside the UN system. And as one of the people who used to be inside the UN system, I could see both. And I would see states giving reports in Geneva and being commented on their failure to implement human rights. And those same states issuing reports that in many ways look remarkably similar, because here's what we're doing on security and human rights, security and counterterrorism, being lauded by the UN security architecture in New York. So it's kind of like an a la carte menu for states. You get to choose where you might want to show up. And the result is, for many states, that actually showing up in New York in the counterterrorism spaces has far more advantages than showing up in the Geneva space. And the result of these Security Council resolutions is quite extraordinary. And so I'm going to do an audience participation moment. How many of you have been on a plane recently? Hands in the air. Okay. How many of you had your photographs scanned as you got on a plane? How many of you said no to having your photograph scanned? That exercise of having your biometric data taken is the result of a UN Security Council resolution on terrorism in 2017 that required every state on the planet to collect biometric data on all of its citizens without any human rights conditionalities. And that came under a Chapter 7 resolution of the UN that mandates compliance. And how many of us know that? We don't, because most of us don't assume that that kind of legislating is happening at the Security Council. But more than that, we don't understand that the implementation of those kinds of directives by our governments is happening as a result of counterterrorism compliance. And so I think that stresses 2 points that I want to make. One is the extent to which the normalization of counterterrorism has become entrenched in a way that we just don't even know it anymore. Second, that we really don't even know where these norms are coming from and what the interaction between our national legal systems and these global security systems. And third, that we don't really fully understand the scope of repression enabled by these global mandates on counterterrorism, whether those are domestic or international. All right, let me talk about Alice in Wonderland for a minute, my third motif, which is around these soft legal norms. And again, as I said at the beginning, soft law is kind of an oxymoron. It shouldn't really exist because law is either hard or not hard. But it turns out that in international law, many of us, including human rights activists, have made long and good use of soft law norms. Because when we can't convince states to write treaties, well, sometimes we can convince them to do other things. We can convince them to have a General Assembly resolution. We can convince them to have a declaration. But in the counterterrorism realm, I would say that soft law has been running on speed. And what we've seen is a proliferation of norms and institutions. And a couple of important things about soft law. One is that it's produced by states that have lots of interest in non-democracy and are not necessarily transparent. And second, that soft law production in counterterrorism, unlike in human rights or in the environment, is a rights-free zone. Namely, the actors and institutions engaged in producing these norms don't sit in the regular multilateral frameworks. They have spaces of their own. And the spaces of their own, I'm going to use one example. The most important international law organization most of us have never heard of is something called the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. And I see Haroon nodding because you know that if you are a small country who doesn't pass through the Financial Action Task Force, your banking system doesn't work. Well, the Financial Action Task Force is basically a soft law institution. There's no hard law here. It's all recommendations. But states comply. And one of the major planks of the FATF work is countering terrorism finance. And what I have seen in multiple countries is the use of countering terrorism financing measures to shut down civil society. Because it turns out that you don't need to lock up human rights defenders or journalists. You can administratively destroy them 10,000 different ways without ever doing any physical harm, but you can absolutely prevent them doing their work. It's the same kinds of tactics that anti-abortionists use in the United States when they made sure that you couldn't open a clinic unless you were conversant in the 20 local regulations to open your doors. And so the turn in counterterrorism to soft law, I think, is really important. First, because the scale of norm proliferation has been intense. And it's really difficult, I would say, for those of us who work even to keep up with the kinds of norms that are produced. The second is that these norms are being produced in spaces where many actors who normally participate in the global norm-making processes just don't have access. And that is particularly true of human rights actors. The third is that states are increasingly treating these hard norms as soft and telling international human rights experts that they don't have to comply with treaty law because these other norms are more important to them. And finally, what we see is a nexus of enforcement for these norms that doesn't exist for human rights law and incentives for states to do it. And the result of all of that is an undermining of our international legal order or norms-based framework. And it also fundamentally undermines our capacity to hold states accountable for human rights violations when they commit them. So let me close out my last 10 minutes in talking about the costs of this promiscuous counterterrorism. And the vulnerability and costs of counterterrorism, I think, are most acutely felt by civil society around the world. You know, many of us, I spent the last 6 years writing UN reports, and I would very seriously go to the General Assembly and or the Human Rights Council and talk about the ways in which counterterrorism and security was undermining global civil society. But in many ways, states are not prepared to listen to that. What we understand, and what a year ago I issued something called the Global Study on the impact of counterterrorism on civil society. And if you're bored, you can Google www.defendcivicspace.com, comes with videos and testimonials from civil society actors around the world. And what I learned and my team learned as we did that work was that security and counterterrorism infrastructures around the world are acting in ways that are both reinforcing and undermining not just human rights, but the capacity of civil society to breathe. There are 5 things that I'd say I would highlight as the consequence of this sort of 20 years of ascendant counterterrorism. First is that civil society experience what you might call complex and compounding misuse of measures and practices. It's not just that people are being locked up or surveyed, it's that people are being locked up and surveyed, and they're being subject to terrorism financing measures, and they can't travel. So it's not one measure, it's multiple overlapping security measures meeting civil society in their place. The second is that the experience of civil society is consistent and undulating. These aren't one-off practices. These are hardwired, consistent, repeat player practices in countries like Egypt, in countries like Turkey. Civil society doesn't get done one day. They're just constantly under these pressures. The goal is effectively to get rid of civil society. The third is that in all of these places where states are using counterterrorism or security measures, they are using exceptional legal norms. The exception has overtaken the rule. The fourth is that in all of these places, what we see allied with the use of these complex compounding measures is discrimination. Discrimination that's directed against religious, ethnic, cultural minorities, women, girls, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and gender diverse persons. These are all specifically and consistently being targeted by these measures. And finally, there's no oversight and there's few remedies. The remedies don't exist at national level, and globally, as we see the entrenchment of these counterterrorism regimes and institutions, the capacity to seek remedy globally doesn't exist either. And so today, just 3.2% of the world's population live in countries with open civic space. At least in the last year, we've seen an increase of up to 28% of countries where civic space is completely closed, where individuals can't just function. And so the point of that is that counterterrorism isn't about targeting those people we might agree on are terrorists. It is actually fundamentally a much more dangerous project. It's a project of targeting the very basis of inclusive, open societies. And in doing so, counterterrorism has been strategic in its moves and its language. It has understood, I think, that both at the level of the regulatory, but also at the mundane level, that this operationalization of counterterrorism and its adoption in particular by democratically backsliding and authoritarian regimes is a deliberate embrace. Let me just say a word or two about gender, and in particular the interface between gender and counterterrorism. It's fair to say that as the first woman UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism, most of the spaces that I walked in were gendered male. These are the security sector spaces that dominate counterterrorism are the police, the military, the intelligence services, prison personnel. And of course, counterterrorism norms and institutions are, and those elite settings that produce them, are gendered male and typically misogynistically and militarily so. And they're informed by deeply held gendered stereotypes. National security institutions, the kinds of spaces that are producing, validating, and propagating these norms, are basically dominated by affluent men lacking ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity. And it's not just that these counterterrorism institutions suffer from an acute diversity crisis along gender and race lines, but they also function. They're inbred with cultures of discrimination, of misogyny, and gender bias that actually perpetrate the work of counterterrorism in ways that reproduce those institutionalized cultures. And they are institutionalized cultures that also perpetrate and produce gender inequality and cultures of impunity, while rewarding traditionally masculine traits and behaviors, including technocratic knowledge, justification of the use of force, decisiveness over moral considerations, and masculinist protection narratives. And it's that complex reality. It's not just that we have a huge burden in terms of human rights, but we have a huge burden in terms of addressing the genderedness of these spaces and how the reproduction of certain kinds of gender stereotypes in these spaces is actually integral to producing the norms, the kinds of norms and institutions that we have. So I'm going to close by saying, what do we do after that when everyone wants to go to a bar and get a gin and tonic and say it's all so bad? Where do we go next? And I think it's hard. It's really hard to be, it's hard to be optimistic. It's 20 years post 9/11 plus. Counterterrorism remains ascendant in the UN system and beyond. And the truth is that none of that work has demonstrated any capacity to actually prevent and counter violence, to be clear. The evidence is actually in the opposite direction. If you look at places like Mali or the Sahel, it's a decade of investment in counterterrorism that has led to a collapse of the state, that has produced dire human rights violations and the economic dysfunction that pervades the entire region. So the other obvious point is that it doesn't work, actually. Counterterrorism has abjectly failed to address the root causes of violence in contemporary conflicts, whether that's Israel and Palestine, Syria or Iraq. And while states have adopted and in fact repurposed this language domestically, those of you who are listening to language about extremism, another word that doesn't have a definition in international law, we see that the consequences of this has also been to facilitate permissive domestic regulation that politicizes and polarizes, primarily based on repurposing what we've done overseas at home. And again, none of this is driving or addressing the drivers of violence. So the costs of the continuation of the status quo are considerable. Support to counterterrorism and security provides succor to authoritarian regimes and backsliding democracies. And tragically, genuine counterterrorism efforts focused on defined acts of terrorism under international law actually remain woefully underaddressed. And anyone who's spent any time with a victim of terrorism will know that the victims of terrorism themselves are the ones who are most left behind in this context. So what do we need to do? Well, can we do alternative things? To do alternative things, I think, would require a profound recalibration and contemporary reorganization of security and counterterrorism models. It would mandate new forms of multilateralism, which, despite their current elusiveness, are a necessary part of reinvigorating the marginalized role that international institutions actually play in prevention. It has to crucially focus on the root causes of violence. And again, where would we start with that? Well, we might start with the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we listened to the debates a couple of weeks ago at the General Assembly, while we've made some progress, it's very clear that the discussions are still failing to deliver resounding financial and political commitment to the SDGs, or to fundamentally address how development itself is being undermined or stealthily driven to the ground by these security agendas. So the first place I would start is I would undo UN counterterrorism, which is paid for by 2 states. Anybody want to guess who pays for UN counterterrorism? The United States? No. Do you want to shout it? I didn't hear it, so somebody else will double shout it. It's not the United States. It's not China, it's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the government of Qatar who pay for UN counterterrorism. And so you sort of get what you pay for. And I would suggest a good place to start would be to significantly prune the current UN architecture of counterterrorism. The second thing we need to do is we need to, in a world which is, I think all of us would agree, devoid of a meaningful commitment to peace, ensure that peacemaking becomes the fundamental UN policy imperatives. And one of the things that worries me is that in our new agenda for peace, counterterrorism is making an insidious creep to be part of that agenda. Finally, the United Nations has to help states like Mali and Sri Lanka end the practices of leveraging counterterrorism as a cover for poor governance, economic failure, and a crackdown on civil society. And to do that, the UN and other multilateral organizations have to be clear-eyed in calling out the abuse of human rights in the name of countering terrorism. The UN can't have moral ambiguity on the causes or costs of terrorism, but it has to be unflinchingly focused on the conditions that produce it. So I look forward to your questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lecture, and this